Welcome to Final Fantasy IX Translation Analysis, a video series where I compare the game's English translation to the original Japanese script and go over some of the most fun and interesting differences. If this is your first time, that's alright. You don't need to have seen the previous episodes to enjoy this one, but if you do enjoy it, then afterwards you can go check the playlist for the series on my channel. As you can see, this is the 9th episode and we're about halfway through this too, with Zidane, Vivi and Garnet setting off towards the outer continent, which is actually one of my favorite parts of the game. Partially because Zidane really gets to shine here as a charismatic protagonist and reliable leader. But of course, one thing he is also known for is being a bit of a pervert. Everyone who played the game in English knows that already, but how lewd is Zidane in Japanese? Could he possibly be even more of a pervert than in English? If you'd like to know the answer to this most pressing question, then stick around. After Zidane, Garnet and Vivi escape from Bran's clutches, she hires two rogues to go after them, and tells them that one of their objectives is to assassinate the black mage traveling with a princess. In English, Bran doesn't really justify this particular focus of killing Vivi. She just says that he's a defect that's running free. But in Japanese, there is an additional line that didn't make it to English, where she says, "Takoku no te ni wataru mae ni katazuke ne ba naran." It must be dealt with before it falls into the hands of other countries. So yeah, essentially, she doesn't want rival nations to use Vivi to reverse engineer their own army of black mages. Now of course, one could surmise this even in English, but it's nice to have confirmation. The first of these two rogues to waylay the party is the boisterous woman named Lani, who appears before our heroes just as they enter Fossilu on their way to the outer continent. Upon seeing her, Zidane reacts in a curious way, prompting an amusing little interaction between him and Garnet. Have we met? Quit flirting with her! Yes, ma'am. This is a pretty funny exchange, so let's take a look at the Japanese. In Japanese, upon seeing Lani, Zidane asks, "Dochira-sama?" Which is basically a really polite and courteous way of asking who she might be. And Zidane doesn't normally do polite, so it's obvious that he's taken in by Lani's appearance. Garnet's subsequent admonishment to him is a little different in Japanese, however. Rather than telling him to stop flirting with Lani, she tells him, "Hana no shita nobasanai de yo." Literally translated, this line is hilarious, so let's let Google Translate do the honors. Don't stretch under your nose? See, this is an idiomatic expression, and its literal meaning is exactly that, to stretch or extend the area between your nose and upper lip, also known as the philtrum. But what the expression actually means is to have a lewd look on one's face, or to ogle someone, meaning to stare in a lecherous manner. So yeah, if the rumors of a Final Fantasy IX remake turn out to be true and they decide to, say, give us a glimpse of Zidane's first-person view in this scene, we can kinda guess what that would look like. No wonder it's so hard to steal the coral sword from Lani during her boss battle. I mean, how could Zidane possibly concentrate under these circumstances? But hey, Garnet doesn't need to be too jealous of Lani here because Zidane will also show her some lascivious attention in the near future. In fact, in the interest of answering the question in this episode's title, let's momentarily skip ahead to when that happens in order to determine, once and for all, just how lewd Zidane is in Japanese. In Madain Sari, Zidane and Dagger have the following interaction in English. If you need to, you can cry too, Dagger. My shoulder's always available. Yeah, thanks. What about you, Zidane? What do you do when you need to cry? Oh, I get really clingy when I'm sad. Huh. Notice Garnet's body language there. That's a pretty strong physical reaction. Could it be because she's reacting to a very different line from Zidane in the original script? Well, here's how the scene goes in Japanese. "Daga mo nakitai toki wa naite ii nda ze. Itsu demo ore no mune kashite yaru kara sa." If you want to, you can cry too, Dagger. I'll lend you my chest anytime. As you can see, this first line is quite faithfully translated in English, except that in Japanese, Zidane offers his chest rather than his shoulder. Obviously because in English, when we talk about crying on someone else's body part, we usually say shoulder, even though, practically speaking, people often cry into the other person's chest. Anyway, the rest of the conversation goes as follows. Arigato. Ne, Zidane wa? Zidane wa souyu toki, dou suru no? Thank you.
What about you, Zidane? What do you do when you feel like crying?
もちろん、ダガの胸を借りるわけさ。Naturally, I'll just borrow your chest, Dagger. Oh, yeah, that's a little different. No wonder Garnet's reaction seemed a little off and exaggerated in English, to me at least, because remember, in English, Zidane simply says that he gets clingy when he's sad. But usually, when we say someone is clingy, we don't mean in the sense of physical contact. Rather, a clingy person is someone who constantly orbits around another without giving them any privacy or alone time, usually because they yearn for emotional support, and not necessarily due to a desire for physical intimacy. Children can be clingy with their parents, for instance. So Garnet physically recoiling from Zidane saying he gets clingy seems a little off to me. Plus, it's just not as funny in my opinion. Although, I have to admit, she totally set herself up for that line in Japanese.
Yeah, I can cry into your chest, so what will you do when you feel like crying, Zidane?
Gee, I wonder. Maybe that's what you wanted to hear. Anyway, I just wonder what prompted this change. Like, was it simply because crying on someone's shoulder is a more common expression in English, and so they went with it, and then had to alter the rest of the conversation to fit that? Or was it because the original line was deemed a little too spicy? I suppose we'll never know. But what we do know is that Zidane can be pretty lewd, even more so in Japanese. But hey, at least he keeps to women his age, unlike a certain other womanizer in a previous Final Fantasy, who is so inappropriate that the English translation definitely censored him. But back to Final Fantasy IX. We finally reach the outer continent and find our first settlement, and since I'm not even sure how its name is meant to be pronounced in English, I'll just use the Japanese pronunciation, Conde, which is actually how the place was also called in other translations such as German. But yeah, that's one of the advantages of the Japanese language. There's no ambiguity when it comes to the pronunciation in Japanese, because each kana or phonetic character possesses only one possible reading, so what you see is always what you get. When we get to this new location, an amusing interaction takes place after Quina immediately runs off to look for food. This is how it goes in English. Jeez, all S/he ever thinks about is food. Well, all you ever think about is girls. That's right. My mind is filled with thoughts of you. Maybe I'm trying too hard. The Japanese version of the scene is quite similar, except for Zidane's last line, where instead of maybe I'm trying too hard, he says, Kyou mo shinte nashito, which can be roughly translated as, no progress made today either, huh? Little did he know that he was about to get married on the very next day. How's that for progress? We go inside Conde and find out it's a village of dwarves, who use the same greeting as the dwarves from Final Fantasy IV. Or, at least in Japanese, it reads exactly the same, Rariho. But once again, in English, there's a translation-induced discrepancy because while in Final Fantasy IV the greeting was translated as Laliho, in Final Fantasy IX, it becomes Rallyho. Perhaps because they thought it would fit better with the Scottish accent that they gave to the dwarves in the English localization. In Japanese, by the way, the dwarves speak in a rather coarse and unrefined manner and end virtually all of their sentences with the verbal tick do, similar to how Mughals always end their sentences with kupo. After Zidane and company spot a black mage, they follow him back to the hidden black mage village, where, as I alluded to last time, we get some of the best scenes in the whole game. I've already spoken a bit in episode 3 about the scene with Zidane talking about his past and Vivi's situation, which is where one of the main themes and recurring motifs of Final Fantasy IX is most openly addressed, that is, the idea of a place to call home, which Zidane, Garnet, Vivi, and other characters all yearn for. At first, I sort of expected the equivalent of that expression in the Japanese script to be ibasho, which is a very meaningful term and concept in Japanese culture, that essentially means a place where a person feels like they belong and feels like they can be themselves and be accepted. And I do feel that that is more or less what they mean in Final Fantasy IX when they talk about a place to call home. But in Japanese, they don't actually use the term ibasho, but rather the expression itsuka kaeru tokoro. This is comprised of 3 words. Itsuka means someday, kaeru means to return, and it's usually used in the sense of going home specifically, and tokoro means place. So, as you've probably guessed by now, this is why you often see the opening theme song of Final Fantasy IX being called The Place I'll Return to Someday, for that is the literal translation of its Japanese title, which is the expression that Zidane uses in this scene, Itsuka kairu tokoro. But although I've grown fond of the title The Place I'll Return to Someday, after seeing it for so many years, it's probably my favorite song in the series actually, nevertheless, it is a very literal translation. So as far as the in-game script goes, I would say that A Place to Call Home is definitely a more apt and natural sounding translation that retains the meaning and spirit of the original. We then get one of the most touching scenes in the game, but thankfully it's masterfully translated, so I don't have to go over it and record myself crying. So let's just go back to Conde Apata, where Final Fantasy IX once again shows how diverse and complete it is as an experience, because after that incredibly poignant tearjerker of a scene with Vivi in the Black Mage Village, we now get arguably the greatest comedic scene in the whole game, where our party members have to marry each other in order to proceed beyond Conde Apata. And just like last time, the translation is so good that there's not that much to analyze here. But, in case you were wondering, yes, Zidane also calls himself a stud in Japanese, and the term he uses is a compound word comprised of two kanji, iro otoko. The second one is simply the word and kanji for man, otoko, while the first one, iro, normally means color, but it also has a secondary meaning that denotes sensuality or sexiness, so if you attach it to other kanji, it often forms a compound word with sexual connotations. For example, if you put it before the kanji ki, which normally means spirit or mood, it becomes iroke, meaning sex appeal. Likewise, if you put it before the kanji for man, otoko, it becomes iro otoko, meaning a lady killer or a playboy, or, as Zidane says in the English translation, a stud. Also, the last time we touched upon Zidane's urges, in episode 4, I mentioned that whereas in English he says his hoping dagger will reward him with a kiss, in Japanese he specifies that he wishes for not just any kiss, but a hot kiss, and this scene follows up on that. In English, Zidane says, "Time for the kiss," but in Japanese he is once again more specific and asks for a hot kiss. Which is understandable, I mean, they're now officially husband and wife, but of course, Garnet gives him the slip, and Zidane falls on his face, and the joke is on him. In English, this scene ends with another classic line of his, playing hard to get, eh? But in Japanese, the line is quite different. Soyu ochi nano ne. This is a somewhat tricky line to translate because the only meaningful word here is ochi, which can mean outcome, but can also mean punchline, as in, you know, the final part of a joke, which is meant to provoke laughter. And I'd say that's probably the intended meaning here, so Zidane is essentially saying, so that's the punchline, huh? So yeah, this almost feels like a quasi fourth-wall breaking moment of slapstick humor, with Zidane verbally acknowledging the fact that he was the butt of the joke there, and still didn't get his kiss after the marriage, and instead fell flat on his face. It's amusing, but I think I prefer the English version's playing hard to get, eh? Which was a pretty inspired localization. Of course, the hilarity isn't over just yet because we then get the option of having Vivi and Quina marry as well, and you'd have to be downright evil not to pick that option. And so the two newlywed couples go off on their honeymoon, and the hilarity continues because they soon run into, in my opinion at least, one of the funniest characters in the game. But that's a story for another episode. Alright, thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, then please hit the like button, and if you haven't watched all the previous episodes and would like to, here's a link to the playlist with all 9 episodes so far. Look forward to episode 10, where we'll get to know Eiko in Japanese, and possibly the last party member as well. Alright, that's all for now. See you next time, Choco Bros.